one of our local people from up in Millersburg who is going to do a talk and demonstration on Native American Indians. And if you've never seen it before, you're in for a very good experience tonight because he puts on a very good show. Jim?
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to be talking about the Indians of Pennsylvania, in particular the Indians that live in this area here. Now, the history of the Indians in this area goes back to about 17,000 BC. Until 1972, the oldest Indian site in Pennsylvania was right down here at Enderline on Dividing Ridge, the Shoup site. Everybody know about the Shoup site? It's an Ice Age Indian campsite. They believe it was inhabited about 12 to 13,000 years BC. And until 1972, that was the oldest Indian site they knew of in Pennsylvania, although it was never dated. And then in 1972, about 30 miles south of Pittsburgh, there was a rock shelter along a little creek, and they excavated this. The University of Pittsburgh excavated it. When they got down to a depth of 14 feet in this rock shelter, they found charcoal from a fire. And they sent this charcoal away to be tested. Anytime you have something that was once alive, you can tell how old it is, because each year it loses a certain amount of the radioactivity that it has. So they sent this charcoal away to be tested, and the results came back 17,150 years BC. The trees from which this fire was made were alive. So there were Indians south of Pittsburgh, 17,000 BC, and they believe probably there were Indians in Pennsylvania about 20,000 years BC. Now these were the Indians of the Ice Age. They're known as the Paleo Indians, and Paleo is simply a word that means old, the old Indians. They hunted with spears, very much like this. Now in the Middle West, one of the favorite animals of the hunt was the woolly mammoth. They find more woolly mammoth skeletons with these spear points in amongst the bones than any other animal. In the eastern part of the United States, they're not really sure what the favorite animal of the hunt was, because bones don't survive here in the eastern part of the United States because of our moist climate. They deteriorate. Now you have to know where these people came from. I got a little bit ahead of myself. For millions of years, there were no human beings in the Americas, just the animals. And then towards the end of the last ice age, or during the ice age actually, it happened. What happened was water evaporated off the oceans, drifted inland in the form of clouds, and came down in the form of rain. And normally, under normal conditions, the rain would then flow back into the ocean. But during the ice age, it was so cold that the rain froze, came down in the form of freezing rain and snow, and froze, and the glaciers began to build up, so that the glaciers were several miles thick at some places. And when this happened, the level of the ocean dropped down 200 to 300 feet. And when that happened, land that was formerly under the water was now out of the water, and it dried off. A piece of this land appeared between Siberia and Alaska, and it dried off. And when it dried off, some of the first plants that began to grow there were grasses and shrubs. And these grasses and shrubs were the food of the grazing animals of the Ice Age. And these animals were what the Indians hunted for food at that time. The woolly mammoth, caribou, a giant bison. And these animals, as they saw this fresh grass growing on this little bridge of land between Alaska and Siberia, followed the grass out across this bridge, feeding as they went. Now, a woolly mammoth, an elephant today, they say, eats about a ton of hay a day. So if you have a herd of woolly mammoths working their way out onto this grassland, you can tell how many tons of grass they would eat a day, so they had to keep moving. These Indian hunters followed them out. What they believed they did was they hunted in groups of about 20 to 25 people. And what they would do was they'd make a kill, and then they'd butcher this animal. And they'd set up camp there, and they preserved some of the meat, they roast some of the meat, they used some of the bones and if it were a woolly mammoth, the ivory from the tusks for tools. And the herd would start wandering away, grazing its way across this land bridge again. So they'd send 2 or 3 of the young, strong warriors to follow the herd until it got a distance away. They were afraid they would lose it. And then they'd come back. One of the warriors would come back and tell the people where the herd was now grazing. They'd break camp and they'd move up to where the herd was now grazing and make another kill or 2. And this is how they moved across this bridge into Alaska and then down into Canada. And at that time, most of northern Canada, or all of Canada, and most of northern North America were covered by glaciers, except for a little valley down through the western part of Canada. And this is the valley they believe these animals migrated down, and the Indian hunters followed them down into what is now the United States. When they got to the lower edge of the glacier, some of them continued on south, some of them went to the west, and some of them turned and went east along the edge of the glacier, because that's where the animals, the grazing animals, were now moving. As the glacier was retreating, more earth was being made bare and more grass was growing, so they had more grazing areas. So they moved eastward along the edge of the glacier. And some of these animals and the Indians following them arrived in Pennsylvania, and as we now know, about 20,000 years ago. Now in the western part of the United States, when they find the skeleton of a woolly mammoth that was killed by the Indians and butchered, they usually find 4 or 5 of these spear points amongst the bones. But these animals were butchered. And when you butcher a woolly mammoth, you can't turn it over or hang it up. You butcher from the top down just the way it lays. And when they did that, they would recover half of the points on that side of the animal. Now, they did find one woolly mammoth skeleton that had not been butchered by the Indians, but it was killed by them. And that one had 9 of these spear points in amongst the bones. And by the position of the legs, they knew that the Indians never butchered it. It died as it was and was never touched. And they believed, excuse me, that possibly what happened was this woolly mammoth either injured or killed one or more of the hunters, and they had to take care of their injured and dead, so they let that one go. But the point is, it probably took 8, 9 spears to bring down a woolly mammoth. Now they made him in 2 pieces like this, a foreshaft and a main shaft. The reason they did that was because back in the Ice Age, because of the bitter cold, very few trees grew, well, anywhere in the United States, but I'm talking about Pennsylvania now. Some of the only trees that could survive in the bitter cold of the Ice Age were the spruce trees, and just a few scrubby spruce trees would grow. And this was the Indians' only source of wood for making spears and other tools. Now if you drove, say, 4 spear points in on one side of a woolly mammoth and 4 on the other, he wandered away and died. When he fell down, he rolled on the spears and broke them off. They had to start from scratch. And they had not yet invented the axe to chop down trees. There weren't enough trees to chop down. So they would take bone wedges like that and flint wedges like that. And they would drive these into the living spruce tree and split out pieces of wood to make these spear shafts. And then they would take, by the same token, pieces of sharp flint like this, and they would scrape them into shape. So you can see what kind of a long, artist job that would be making one spear shaft. So they decided if we make a, and they discovered if they would taper the end of the foreshaft and put that into a tapered socket like that, when that hit the animal, this piece would either bounce off or would wiggle loose as the animal walked away or ran away, and they could pick this up when they followed him until he bled to death. Then all they needed to do was put another foreshaft in there, and they were ready to use it again. If this little piece stuck out of the animal, of the foreshaft, when he rolled over on that, it just pushed it in a little bit farther. It didn't break it. And they have found some of these foreshafts from the Ice Age, tapered at one end and slotted at the other, not out of wood. Very little wood survives, but out of mammoth ivory. They made them out of mammoth ivory. Now, one of the unique things about this Paleo-Indian site down here at Enderline, the Shoup site, is the material that they made almost 100% of these spear points from is called Onondaga chert. And it comes from Onondaga County, New York. And for a lot of years, as the people of the museum promoted this, they believed that these Indians would wander up to Onondaga County, New York to get stone, this Onondaga chert, to make their flint tools. But there's a gentleman now in Buffalo, New York, who believes if they were getting it here in the area, that the glacier had torn it loose up in Onondaga County and dragged it down and deposited it here in different areas. And I saw on an old topographical map, right outside of Halifax here, headed for Eville, there was at one time a gravel pit that was obviously deposited there by the glacier. On Haldeman's Island, the topographical maps indicate 3 gravel pits that Pennsy Supply now processed and got rid of. But he believes that this Onondaga chert came from a glacial deposit like that. And back in about 19 '84, I was on Holloman's Island, and I found the end of a nodule of Onondaga chert on there. Unfortunately, I lost it, or that would be this guy's proof. He's already written his scientific paper on it. All he needs is the proof. So if any of you people know of a model gray flint that's got a rounded side on it, I'd sure like to see it and photograph it, because I could send it to this guy. That will make this fellow's, the rest of his life, he's 80-some year old now, and that will make his life a success. Okay, now, up to this point, all the stone tools were made by a process called flint knapping, in which these hunters would go to an outcropping of flint somewhere, break large chunks of flint out like this, and then with what they call billets, little clubs made out of antler and hammer stones, they would drive flakes off the perimeter of this piece of flint. I'm going to try to drive one off here without making too much of a mess. That's a piece of flint. So what they would do was to take that piece of flint and they would turn it in their hand and drive flakes off the bottom side. And then they turn it over and turn it again and drive flakes off until they had it all trimmed down and thinned down to something like that. This is what is known as a quarry blade or a blank. They'd go to a flint source and they would rough these quarry blanks out, literally hundreds of them. And they'd carry this back to the campsite then. They'd trim off all the excess flint so they wouldn't have the extra weight. When they got back to the campsite, they would then take that semi-finished piece of flint, put a piece of leather in their hand like that, and then with the tip of a deer antler or a bone, they would push flakes off the edge of the flint like this. And that's how they would do the final shaping and sharpening of the point. If it was to have a base like this, they'd take that antler and make the little notches in it. When the tool got dull, they'd simply lay it on their hand on a piece of leather and run a series of chips off the edge and the tool was sharp again. Now all these chips of flint that they knocked off that main piece of flint to make the tool were in themselves tools. When they're freshly knocked off the core like that, they're razor sharp. And this is what the women use for trimming leather to make garments and moccasins. You can see how sharp that is. The men would use those same pieces of flint for trimming wood. There are probably a few pocket knives in here that sharp. And when the piece of flint became dull, they just threw it away and picked up another one. How many people here hunt arrowheads, collect arrowheads? Nobody? You do? Well, then you know, when you're collecting on an Indian site, you find lots of chips of flint like this. They were, first of all, what they call refuse from the flint industry, but they were also tools. Now, believe it or not, when you make a flint point, very often those chips don't go all the way across, they'll snap out, and there's a little bit of a crack underneath there. So they have collected tools up here at Enderline, at the shoot site, and they've discovered little traces of blood in some of those minute cracks in the points. And they've identified this blood as bovine blood. So they know the Indians down here at Enderline were hunting the giant bison of the Ice Age. The giant bison of the Ice Age stood about 7 feet tall at the shoulder. That's an accurate comparison of the size of an Indian to the size of an Ice Age bison. They were 6 feet from the tip of one antler or horn to the tip of the other. So this is what they were hunting right down here at Enderline. These Indians of the Ice Age, they made a very special point called a fluted point. If I hold it under the light, you can see there's a long chip's been taken off there on either side. These are known as flutes. The Indians of the Americas are the only people in the entire world that ever learned to flute points. And even an expert flint knapper is only 80% successful at putting the flutes on. but they considered it very, very important because they did it for about 10,000 years, the entire time they were here during the Ice Age. It made the point thin in the middle, so when they put it on a shaft and tied it on there and glued it on, there was less chance that that point would twist on the end of the spear shaft when they drove it into an animal. Because if you're hunting an animal the size of an Ice Age bison, you want that spear point to be solid on the end of that shaft, so when you throw that spear, it definitely penetrates. It doesn't twist like that and cut him a little bit and make him real mad. The toolkit of the Ice Age hunters were very small. Consisted of their special spear points and just a few other slightly modified pieces of flint, scrapers and burins that they could work wood and bone with. They had to travel light because they were nomads. They followed the herds of Ice Age animals. So they never stayed very long at one particular spot. That's what's so unusual about the site down here at Enderline. They came back there again and again and again because they lost over 100 of those spear points down there and literally hundreds of other flint tools that they used for working bone and wood. So what they believed was happening was they've identified two different types of Ice Age points there, the D-bird and the shoot Clovis. And they believed two groups of Ice Age hunters would meet there at a certain time of the year. And then they would carry on a hunt, and then they would marry their young men and women back and forth. Because a big taboo among the Indians has always been marrying too close in blood, too close in the family. It's been a big taboo. So they believed that two groups of Ice Age Indians were meeting down here at Enderline, and they would marry off their young people. And then, of course, they would hunt. There was a certain herd of, well, they know what the herd was now. They know it's bison, with Ice Age bison was coming through there at the time. And a lot of archaeologists believe that it was in the spring of the year when they were having their young. And the young were easier to bring down, had a softer, thicker fur, and a thinner skin, and of course more tender meat. And in the spring of the year is when the earth renews itself. So there were lots of plant foods available at that time. Even at that, during the Ice Age, 75% of what the Indians ate was meat from the hunt. And only about 25% of what they had was food plants, simply because there were very few plants growing here at that time. Now, the Ice Age slowly came to an end by about 8,000 BC. Slowly the climate became warmer. The glacier melted and retreated back up into New York State and then up into Canada. And many of the Ice Age animals, which were cold weather animals, followed the glacier north into Canada. The ones that stayed behind were quickly killed off by the Indians, so that by 8,000 BC, Pennsylvania was covered with forests like it was when our ancestors arrived, and the Ice Age animals were gone. Now, the Ice Age hunters were also known as big game hunters because they hunted the giant animals of the Ice Age. But a new period of Indian development began now called the Archaic period at 8,000 BC. Now the chief animal of the hunt was the white-tailed deer. They didn't need the heavy spears of the Ice Age anymore. They became what is known as hunter-gatherers. The men hunted and fished and trapped, and the women gathered food plants in the forest because there were a whole lot more of them now. So that 50% of their diet was now food plants that the women gathered. And two of the first trees that began to grow were leaf-bearing trees in Pennsylvania after the Ice Age were the oak tree and the chestnut tree. Chestnuts and acorns, two big sources of food for the Indians, new sources. So their way of life changed drastically. Now they didn't need the heavy spears of the Ice Age anymore to kill white-tailed deer. So they went to what are known as darts. It was a lightweight spear, much lighter than a spear, but heavier than an arrow. They put feathers on the end because they found out that would make the dart fly truer. And again, just as during the Ice Age, they made them in two pieces, and for the same reason. So most of the points that you find out here in the field when you go arrowhead hunting are not arrowheads at all. They're really dart points, because they used these darts for about 8,000 years. The Archaic period lasted about 7,000 years, and throughout that entire period they hunted with darts, and they would change their campsites about every 15 years. So you can see that they moved their camps from one place to another. You can find archaic campsites about every 150 yards along the river and along some of the side streams. Now I'm going to go through some of the inventions of this new period called the Archaic period. And there was something I was thinking about before I don't want to forget. First of all, for the first time on Indian sites, we're finding stones like this. They've got a hole drilled in them, and they look like they have wings, like a butterfly or a bird. And archaeologists called them banner stones. Originally, they thought that the Indians would put them on the end of a staff, and a person of some high rank would carry these as a symbol of their rank. But then later, they began to find them in burials. And when they found them in burials, they began to find the remains of a bone hook over here, and here was the stone, and down here was what appeared to be the remains of an antler handle, and they determined that they were all fastened together with a piece of wood. And what they were dealing with was a throwing stick that they used to launch these darts when they hunted. That hook fit into a depression on the end of the dart like that. And with this throwing stick, they could throw that dart at least twice as far and twice as hard as you can by hand. And if we were out of doors, I'd have a modern throwing stick and dart, and I'd give you a demonstration. I've had young college students that were actually into throwing the javelin, and they danced down the path and threw the jab or threw my dart, and then I took a dart of the same size, and I'm 65 years old, and I took a modern, this is a modern atlatl. I hooked that in the back of that dart, and without any problem at all, I threw it twice as far as they could throw it. And so the Indians could now hit animals twice as far away. And this is what they used to hunt them for the next about 8,000 years. They have tournaments today worldwide with these throwing sticks, and they call the throwing stick an atlatl. Atlatl is the Aztec word for throwing stick, because when Cortez went into Mexico, the Aztec Indians were still using the atlatl and darts for hunting and for warfare. They hadn't given it up yet. So modern people, modern scientists, and the atlatl people call this the atlatl. And they have these contests all over the world. And two of the world champions come from Pennsylvania. Gary Fogelman from Turbotville and Terry Kiefer from Fort Lawton are two world champions from Pennsylvania. They also hunt with these things on game preserves. There's some people who have killed every American big game animal that there is with an atlatl and darts, just as the Indians. They carried with them a little quiver, and then this quiver were foreshafts for their darts. So when they hit an animal and the main shaft bounced off, they followed it until it of course bled to death and died, but in the process they would pick up that dart and put another foreshaft in, and they were ready to use it again. Another invention of this archaic period is the mortar and pestle. For the first time, there were lots of plant foods in Pennsylvania, and the Indian women would gather these plant foods, and they found they could dry the seeds and the nuts and the roots, and they could pound them into flour or meal with a mortar and pestle. And with this meal, they could mix a little fat and water and make little cakes and bake them on hot stones next to the fire. And this is an actual pestle made and used by an Indian woman just outside of Millersburg, is where I found that. Another invention of this period of time was the grooved axe. Now they had forests here in Pennsylvania, much like our ancestors encountered when they came here. They needed a tool to harvest them. So they invented the grooved axe. The first axes, the stone axe heads, had a groove pecked in around them like that. And then they would soak the hardwood handle in hot water and bend it into that groove, and then tie it with wet rawhide, which of course would shrink down and get very hard, and hold that head in place. And that's how the first axes were made and worked. You can see that it works quite well. Now this also brought with it a new form of stoneworking called pecking and grinding, or battering and grinding. To make the axes, they would take a piece of flint with a sharp corner on it like that. And after first battering it, you can see where it was hit very hard on this edge to knock it around a little bit, and on the bottom to shape it. You can see where the original river cobble was, untouched. And then they would take a piece of flint with a sharp corner, and they would just sit there and peck away the unwanted stone. And you can see the little pits in the stone from the pecking operation. In the groove, here there was a high spot, there was a high spot. Here they took a high spot off, and there, and that's how they would shape these stone tools at this point. When they were ready for the sharp cutting edge, they would take sand, wet sand on a flat rock, and then they would grind the final cutting edge onto that axe. When you find a point in the field, you can never really be sure, was it a dart point or was it a knife? If they put it on the end of a long dart, it was a dart point, but if they put a handle on it like this, then it was a knife. And the only way to really tell is to study them under the microscope and look for scratches made by the bone on the stone. If it was a large blade like this, then it was most likely a knife blade, because archaeologists have determined that the most efficient width for a dart blade is about 3/4 of an inch to an inch. That makes a hole that's just big enough for the rest of the shaft to follow through. A big point like this would not be as useful in using on the end of a spear or a dart, because it takes too much power to drive that large blade through the side of the animal. It wouldn't penetrate deep enough. Now this is a knife blade that's been sharpened very often, you can see by the concave sides. When it was original, it had convex sides, but in the process of sharpening and resharpening, it became concave. If you find a blade with little notches in it like that, see the little notches, they're called serrations, then it was almost surely a knife blade. And with a serrated blade like that, you can actually saw wood. I could keep sawing there until I had that piece of wood actually sawed in half. Now when the Indians broke something, the way they very often repaired it was by drilling holes in the broken pieces and then tying the pieces back together. They even did this with broken cooking pots. They couldn't use them for cooking anymore, but they could use them for storing food. And they had special drills for that. If they were out on the trail and they broke something, they could take one of their spear foreshafts and re-chip the tip to a drill bit. And then just by twirling it by hand, they could drill holes in the broken pieces. See how quickly that drills in there? And repair whatever was broken. If they were back in camp at their lodge, they very often had a drill jig. And there are several different types of drill jig. And very often on Indian sites, when you're looking for arrowheads, you'll find one of these slim flint drill bits. This they could pump. Works a whole lot better if you can put your foot on it. But you can see that drills much faster than twirling it by hand. They made many, many tools out of bone, but here in the East, bone doesn't survive because of our moist climate. But in the West, they found a cave that they excavated, occupied by the Indians, and for every one stone tool, they found 3 bone tools. So we can figure that the Indians of the East made as many bone tools. They just haven't survived. And 2 of the very important tools they made out of bone were the awl and the needle. With the awl, they punched holes in the leather, and then of course with the bone needle, they would sew that leather. And without this, the Indians of the Ice Age would not have been able to make the warm clothing they needed to survive the Ice Age. So it was very, very important. They also made spear points and dart points out of bone, and they could be honed to a very sharp edge. That's the back leg bone of a deer on there. And of course they made fishing hooks out of bone. And they made 2 different types here in Pennsylvania. They made the regular hook as we know it, and they also made what is called a gorge. And this is a sliver of bone that's been pointed at both ends. And when they put the bait on that, they would put it on at an angle like that. And the fish would swallow it the long way. And when it got into his stomach, those sharp points would catch in the stomach and turn the gorge sideways like that, and then the fish was caught. Of course, you had to cut him open to get the gorge back out, but that didn't matter because they didn't catch and release. They caught and ate. And they say that putting that gorge, the bait on the line with the gorge at an angle like that is where the term angling comes from. The archaic period slowly came to an end by about 1000 BC. And about, 1,000 years before that, some of the Indians, but not all, started a new way of life called the transitional, or the Broadpoint Indians. Now they made a few new inventions. First of all, they realized that every year the shad swim north to do their spawning in the river here. And every fall, the eels swim south to go spawning in the Sargasso Sea. And every spring, the geese and the ducks come back up north. And they build nests and lay eggs and raise their young. And these are yearly returning big food supplies. So these Indians that began this new transitional way of life moved to the larger streams to take advantage of these yearly returning food supplies. And for the first time you find stones like that on Indian sites. You know what they are? They're net sinkers. The Indians had learned to make fishing nets. And they made literally hundreds of these net sinkers. They're simply flat stones. With 4 blows, they put a notch on either side, ground that notch a little bit so it wouldn't cut the string, and they put them on the bottom of their nets to keep the fish from swimming under the fishing nets. Another invention by these people, the transitional people, was the cooking pot. The first cooking pots were made out of soapstone, which you got down in the Berks County area. That stone is so soft, you can actually shape it with your thumbnail. You can see that powder under my thumb. I could sit here and actually shape that little pot with my thumbnail. They also conducted heat very well. They put little handles on either side like this so they could put 2 sticks under there and lift the pot into the fire until the food was cooked and then lift it back out. Eventually, from heating and cooling, it would crack and break. And some of the pieces you find of these in the fields are drilled to tie them back together. When it was too badly broken, they took the broken pieces and made ornaments out of them, beads and other ornaments, and banner stones. That banner stone is made out of soapstone. Now they made a new form of axe, these people, called a celt. They no longer put the groove around the axe, which took a whole lot of work. They took the axe blade and made it wedge-shaped, so it fit into a socket. And the more you used it, the tighter it became in the socket. And if you don't hit the wood, the head flies out, which is one of the advantages. But they did work equally well. Now, the reason I said that is because when the axe head finally was sharpened back to the point where it was no longer effective, then they could knock it out of the handle. No, it won't come out. They could knock it back out of the handle, make another axe blade, and put it into that socket and use the handle again. They didn't lose the handle. That's credit to my bad aim with the axe. Now the Indians that didn't subscribe to this transitional way of life, they went into the early woodland period. These Indians, for the first time, started making pots out of clay. And they tell me that Pennsylvania has more clay than any other state in the Union. So for the first time, the Indians were making clay cooking pots. And archaeologists tell us that from this point on, they preferred their food cooked in the form of soups and stews. And there was always a cooking pot on the fire with food in it, so that any time someone came into the house, they had something to eat. When you find these things in burial, and when they buried their dead, they always buried a little food with them to sustain them on their way to heaven. And there'll usually be a turtle shell on top like that. The reason for that is because when they ate the food, they would ladle it out of the cooking pot into the turtle shell and then drink it. So when they buried their dead, they buried food with them and a means of conveying it to their mouth. Very often you'll find these stones on Indian sites with a little notch on either side, a flat stone. These were pot lids. They would tie a little piece of wood on there with a string, and that would fit into the neck of the pot like that. And that would keep the rats and the mice out of it. Wouldn't keep the insects out as a rule, but it would keep the rats and the mice out. Now the archaic Indians, as I mentioned, were hunter-gatherers. The women gathered plant foods in the forest and on the mountain. And of course they became wonderful basket makers. And Indian baskets are highly prized today all over the world. They were that well made. And as these Indian women would bring the food back in these baskets, from time to time the baskets would wear and they'd lose a seed here and there. And they saw that. This was one of the keys to their survival. They observed everything and they forgot nothing. And they didn't forget that the seeds dropped out of the basket there, but it wasn't worth their while to pick them out of the dirt. But next spring, when the spring rains came, they sprouted and grew. And in the village site, where there was more sunlight because the trees had been cut, they grew much larger than in the forest. So the women said, hey, we're not going to run all over the mountain and the woods looking for these plants. We're going to take the seeds and plant them at the village site, and we'll grow them ourselves. So they began to be gardeners, and it was the women's duty to do all the gardening. The man had the duty of going and cutting the trees and burning the brush where the field was supposed to be, and then it was the woman's job to plant the crops, tend the crops, harvest the crops, and cook the crops. Except one, the sacred tobacco. That was the job of the men. So the women's tools for planting were very simple. In April, they go into the fields, and with a digging stick, they put their foot on the end of the digging stick, drive it into the ground, and they loosen the ground throughout the field in April. May was planting month. In May, and this is an actual hoe blade found again right outside of Millersburg. They made the hoe blades out of stone like that. And then they'd find a tree with a suitable handle that would create a suitable handle, chop in and chop below the branch, split it out, and then they would tie the stone hoe blade onto the end of that handle. And in April, May, the women would go out, May's planting month, and they would hoe the soil up with these hoes onto little mounds. Their fields were composed of little mounds of earth. And then they would plant the seeds by punching holes in this mound of earth with a stick called a dibble. And they planted them one at a time. And this was something that the white man had to learn, because most of the crops the white man brought with him were grains that they scattered in the field. The Indians' crops were planted one at a time. Corn, beans, squash, pumpkins, all planted a seed at a time. And they would plant them with ceremony. They honored the four corners of the earth, the east, the south, the west, and the north. So when they planted the seeds, they would plant one for the east, one for the south, one for the west, and one for the north. And when they planted their corn like that, they would wait until the corn was the height of a man's finger. And then with the dibble, they'd go back and they'd punch a hole next to each one of the corn plants, and they'd drop a bean in there. Now the bean would sprout, and as the corn grew, the bean would twine around the corn, and the corn would support it. In addition to this, the beans would grow little nodules on their roots that took nitrogen out of the air and deposited it into the ground so the corn would grow better. So they actually got a 50% greater yield on their crops than we get today, planting one crop in the field at a time. Now back there about 1000 BC, the Indians had a gourd growing here in the eastern woodlands, and from this gourd they developed 5 varieties of squash that we still eat today. And you know what's so nice about it? I bought these at the Giant, right down here. Developed by the Indians about 3,000 years ago. Spaghetti squash, acorn squash, butternut squash, the little summer squash, and the one that's slowly disappearing, this is actually a gourd, but it looks like a patty pan squash. And the patty pan is the 5th squash that was developed about 3,000 years ago by the Indians that we still eat. Another crop they developed way back then was this one here, the sunflower. And this one's become a world food crop like many of the other plants that they developed. The final plant they developed back then was this one here. And that one is eastern woodlands tobacco. This is the one that was planted and tended by the men, the sacred tobacco. For the first time on Indian sites, we begin to find stone tubes like this. And these were the first pipes, the first smoking pipes. They were simply stone tubes. They looked like big cigars. Some of them were this long. They learned very quickly that you had to turn the front end of the pipe up to keep the hot ashes in. So they were making turned up pipes very soon after that. If you see a portrait of an Indian painted by early colonists here in Pennsylvania, you'll usually see the tobacco pouch hanging around his neck like that, and the pipe sticking out of the tobacco pouch. They carried it with them. It was very, very important to them. And when they wanted to smoke, of course, they just scooped some of the tobacco out there, took a burning stick, lit it, and smoked it. Very often they would put the image of an animal on their pipes, an animal they were honoring, their totem animal, that they believed would help to protect them from sickness and other evil. This particular pipe is made out of clay. They made many, many pipes out of clay, and you can still find the fragments in the field. Tobacco also became important to the Indian in their religious life. Before an Indian would say a prayer, he'd take the ceremonial pipe, and he'd put a pinch of tobacco in for every spirit being or every other thing that he wanted to honor. Very often would be a little for the east, the south, the west, and the north, the four directions which he honored, and then an amount for the Creator himself. And they would offer the smoke again to the east, the south, the west, and the north, and finally to the Creator himself. And they believed that the Creator loved the smell of tobacco smoke. And when they smoked that pipe, the Creator would smell it, and he'd look down and say, "Ah, Watashi is smoking the pipe for me." And then Watashi had the Creator's attention, he could say his prayers. Among the Susquehannock Indians, tobacco was so popular that they find tobacco pipes in the graves of the children, the women, and the men. Now, one very important thing to the Indians was string or cordage. And one of the most important plants for making it was this one here. And this is Indian hemp, or dogbane. And you can find this growing along the creeks, along the runs, along the road, all over the place here. But the farmer up in Spring Glen told me it grows on his farm. He said he's been trying to get rid of it for years. He said he's burned it, he's poisoned it, can't get rid of it. See these little skinny seed pods, these double seed pods, is how you can identify it in fall or this time of the year, the old plants. This guy's going to seed here. So what they would do was they would crush the stem of the plant, and then they would break the wood in little pieces and peel it off and save these fibers. Now this is the strongest fiber. This dogbane here has the strongest fiber of any plant in Pennsylvania for making string. String for fishing lines, for fishing nets. If you take two pieces of string and put them together, you have a piece of twine for a snare, rope for tying bundles together, tying sticks together to make towers or wigwams. And it's very easy to make. What they found early on, and this is the basis of making string, was that if you take those fibers and you twist them together like that, they're much stronger than they are untwisted. And I guess one day they put them together and it formed a loop like that. And that is the basis of making string. You hold that loop in your fingers, twist the top strand away and pull it down. Twist the top strand away and pull it down like this. And this is how they made their string. So in the evening, when the men came back from the hunt and the women were finished in the fields, they had their evening meal, they'd sit around the fire and tell stories and do things like making string. And once that's twisted like that, together like that, it will not unravel. And a piece of string made from this dogbane, 1/4 of an inch thick, will support 83 pounds. The only stronger fiber that we have in Pennsylvania, we didn't have it at the time of the Indian, is yucca. That will support 94 pounds. That's the strongest fiber, but that was not here at the time of the Indian. Next to the fields, the Indians would build a tower very much like this, with a covering on it to protect the person inside from the rain and from the sun. And it was the job of the young girls to sit in that tower and sing to the crops. And they believed if they sang to the crops, they would grow much better. In addition to that, the voice of somebody nearby kept the animals from raiding the fields. And we know today they perform experiments in schools where they take two groups of plants, and for the one group of plants they play music, and for the other group they do not. And the plants that hear the music actually do grow better. Down to the last period of Indian development, the late period, the late woodland period. These are the Indians that our ancestors met when they arrived here. They were now hunting with bows and arrows, and they believed that they got the invention of the bow and arrow from the Vikings, who started making trips to America about the same time. The arrows in the eastern woodlands all had little triangular points. These are the only points ever used on arrows in the eastern woodlands. And like the darts and the spears before them, they were made in two pieces. So when that arrow hit an animal, that piece went in, this piece bounced off, and this piece was preserved. And again, when the animal fell on the short foreshaft, it just pushed it in a little bit farther, and they could recover it when they butchered the animal. And they actually have some of these foreshafts in the State Museum that were preserved with the wood on them yet. They believed in one God here in the eastern woodlands. They call him Gikalamukum. That was a mistake because the white men didn't know what that meant. Translated from the Lenape language, it means he who creates us by his thoughts, the creator. As Conrad Weiser remarked once, he said, if these early critics of the Indians had listened to what they were saying and tried to understand, they would have realized that they're not too much different from ourselves. So they called their God the creator, much like many of us. They believed in many spirit beings. Do we believe in spirit beings? Sure we do. The good ones are angels, the bad ones are demons. Well, the Indians believed the same thing. There were good spirit beings and bad spirit beings. And this guy here was a good spirit being. Now, he doesn't look like a human being, because he's not. He's a spirit being. But he doesn't really look fearsome. He just looks different. His name is Masingwa. And his job was to justify to the animals why the Indians should be allowed to take some of the animals from time to time for food and clothing. So he was a very important spirit being. And once a year, they would have a dance to honor him, in which they would wear a mask, a red and black mask, and dress up in a bearskin robe and do a dance to honor Masingwa. And they claimed that from time to time, they could see Masingwa riding through the forest on the back of a big deer. They made feather cloaks. They used every part of the animal and the bird, and they would save the turkey feathers and make feather cloaks. Now this is just a small section, but they made these cloaks long enough to go from the top of the head down to the ground. And the early settlers claimed that the Indian feather cloaks were as warm as any white man's blanket. In addition to that, they were waterproof. The water ran off them. For undergarments in winter, they took the bark of the milkweed plant and they made cloth, a thick cloth that they wore under their regular clothing in winter to keep warm. Before the white man came, or when the white man came, he brought with him these glass trade beads. And the Indians loved these trade beads. They never had anything that beautiful before, and to them they were treasures. And the white men thought these Indians are really fools. They trade these valuable animal skins like otter and fisher and beaver for these cheap trinket beads. But the Indians thought these white men are fools. They trade these treasures for these scruffy animal hides that we can find in the forest anytime. So both sides were satisfied. But before they started decorating with glass beads, they decorated with these things here. You know what they are? Porcupine quills. They would take the porcupine quills and sort them according to size, and then they would dye them. And then they would apply them to a knife case or a shirt or a pair of moccasins. And if you see pictures of some of the moccasins that were decorated in other clothing by the Indians with porcupine quills, they're absolutely beautiful. For most of the time they were here in America, or Pennsylvania, they built their lodges round like this. They would drive saplings into the ground and then bend them around like this and tie them with string and twine, just as I showed you before. And then they would cover them with sheets of bark or tightly woven grass mats. There was a smoke hole on top, and if you look inside, you'll see there's a fireplace in the middle right there. And this is the type of hut they lived in for most of the time they were here in Pennsylvania. Francis Burke, a Schuylkill County archaeologist, excavated a site at Minnow Run that goes back to the Archaic period. So back there about 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 years, and all the huts were circular like this. And they also excavated a village of the late woodland period down near Millersburg. And there were 54 round huts in this village, so many thousand years later. It was only the Lenape and the Iroquois that in the very latest part of their development started building the longhouses. And that was to get everybody together into a stockaded village, because by that time they were making war with each other. They were growing so many good crops, they had so much food, they had too much time on their hands. And when you have too much time in your hands, that's when you could start getting funny thoughts. You make rules and regulations, and it's easy for a neighbor to somehow insult you, and then you go to war. And by the time the white men arrived here, the Indians had developed 5 basic varieties of corn that they were growing. They had developed sweet corn. They had developed what we call Indian corn. They called it flint corn because it has a very hard shell and it's more impervious to insect damage, but the flour from it was a little gritty because of that hard shell. They developed what they called a flour corn, had a very soft shell, made the best flour, but it was subject to more insect damage because the insects could chew through it. They developed popcorn. And the final one that they developed that we almost left die out was this one here, and that's pod corn. This one's very rare anymore. Each one of the kernels on that cob has a husk around it. And all the husk kernels are on a cob with a big husk around them. And that was too much trouble to harvest and process for the white man, so he almost left that one die out. They developed three major crops called the Three Sisters. And these they depended on for most of their food. And it was corn, beans, and squash. And the bean was much like a pinto bean, and some of them were much like a kidney bean, a red bean like a kidney bean. To preserve them for winter, they would put them in boiling water for a minute or two, and that killed any mold, and it also killed the germ inside so they wouldn't start sprouting before spring. The squash and the pumpkins, they cut into slices, put them on sticks, and dried them in the sun. What I'm holding in my hand here, after it's dried, are two of those squashes, quite large squashes, so they could store a whole lot of squash in a very small place after they were dried. And in the course of cooking, once the cooking pot was boiling, they'd take a handful of squash and put it in. They'd cut up some meat and put that in, and they had a stew in short order. One of the favorite things of the Lenape men, most often found in their burials, was the flute. They loved to play the flute, and when they were young men and courting a young lady, they would very often sit in the forest near where she lived and play for her on their love flute. And if there was more than one man was interested in the young lady, very often different men were playing at different times. And oftentimes the one that played the most beautiful music won the young maiden. Or something like that. Among the women, the favorite object was the antler comb or bone comb, and they had jet black hair, so you can see how beautiful a white comb like that would look in their jet black hair. And this is one of their favorite items. And I guess I could say it's a favorite item of a lot of Americans, because I would set my things up at the farm show several years in a row now, and every year they steal the antler comb I have. This is the third antler comb I've made. The last year I was there, it was only on the table 2 hours and it was gone. From very early times, the Indians knew how to make fire. I told you about the Meadowcroft site out near Pittsburgh during the Ice Age. Charcoal from the fire they built is what they used to date it. Originally, the first Indians, they would make it by twirling a stick by hand in the fireboard. This is the fireboard, this is the drill. They would put the drill on the fireboard, and by twirling it like this, they could actually twirl it until it got so hot, it created a small glowing coal in that little crack on the fireboard. And I've seen people do this, but they've got a lot harder hands, tougher hands than I do, and better muscles. Later Indians learned that they could use what's called a drill and bow. And the components of this fire-making kit were then the fireboard, a drill which they would spin in that fireboard until enough hot charcoal collected in that little crack there that it started to glow. Then you needed some kind of a bearing to put on top of that drill so it had something to rotate in. And of course a bow to spin it. So all you needed was to take a piece of rawhide along and a stick to make the bow you could find along the trail anywhere. You don't have smoke alarms in here that I can see, right? Okay, because it makes a little smoke. I did this once at some school down at Hershey, and the teachers were worried to death I was going to set the smoke alarms off. Okay, it's very easy to make the bow. Now this is not the easiest because I've got to put my foot up on the table. They didn't have to do that. They made this on the ground. by sawing the bow back and forth, you can spin that grill. Not doing a very good job. Let me try it. Work better like I do it on a chair. I'm not going to get it going cold. That chair gets in the way. But if I spun that for about a minute, minute and a half, I would get it going cold in there. You put that in tinder and blow on it, and you have fire. One thing I want to show you yet is the tracks. Before I go to that, their favorite weapon of war was the war club. And they made two types. The elbow war club would have had a point on it, sometimes a antler or bone, sometimes a flint or steel when the white man came. The other type was the bull war club. This is the one you see more often. And the Indians have the most fragile skeleton of any people on earth. So these war clubs are very devastating to them. Now they made many, many types of tracks. But two that we're most familiar with, because the white man made these also, he learned to make these from the Indian, are the snare and the deadfall. The snare is made by finding a sapling in the area you want to trap your animal, trimming all the limbs off it so it can snap up very quickly. And the trigger is made out of two sticks. The one hooks around the back of the tree, and this part of the trigger stick fits into a notch on the trunk of the tree and into the other trigger stick. Then we've got to set the noose. The bait goes on the end of the trigger stick here. And then of course you have to drive sticks around the side and the back of the snare so the animal approaches it from the right direction. And if I forget to mention that and there are kids in the crowd, they say, what's stopping from coming in from behind? You've got to drive those sticks in first. The animal comes in, nibbles on that trigger stick, he's caught in a square. Now they made these snares big enough to catch deer. And that's the reason they're illegal in Pennsylvania today. Because the early white men would set these snares on the deer trail. And the trigger was a stick across the trail. When the deer's foot had hit that trigger stick, he'd be yanked up in the air. Well, the bad part was white men would walk the deer trails looking for deer. And they'd walk into the snare and be killed. So these things are illegal in Pennsylvania today. The second trap is the deadfall. And this is made with two logs. You drive 4 stakes in the ground as guides for those logs. The trigger is made out of 3 sticks in this case. You put the bait on the end of this trigger stick here. And once again, you must drive stakes around the deadfall so the animal approaches it from the right direction. Now this is a very, very small one. But they made these things big enough to catch bears. It took several men to lift the top log. And then they tie a huge rock on top as well. And when that came down, it had to surely crush him. So the animal entered from this side, nibbled on the trigger stick, he was caught on the trap. Now, if there were little girls in the crowd, they'd say, "Can't you get him out of there?" Does anybody have any questions? Oh, one more thing. A little folder here. This has nothing to do with the Indians, but it might be of interest to you. A short while ago, a lady that I do a newsletter for gave me 3 books. And these are books of the history of Pennsylvania that this guy has researched. And it's really fascinating reading. The story of Fort Halifax is in here. I'm assuming you all know how Fort Halifax got started. Yes? Can I read it very quickly? Just a short piece. The woman that I do a newsletter for gave me a call and said, "Come on out to the senior center. That's where I always pick up the information." She said, "I have something for you." And I thought, she's got another newsletter for me to do. I came out, she had these 3 books that she found and bought for me. Now they look like they're on the old style because of the color of the covers, but they were just done the last couple of years. They're written by a guy by the name of John L. Moore in Northumberland, and he has researched this stuff and gotten these old stories, and it's absolutely fascinating reading. And the story of Fort Halifax is in here. If you want to bear with me, I'll read it very quickly, if I can find it. Okay, this 1756, and that's why I wondered about it. I saw the date on here, 1794.
That's when Halifax was founded.
Oh, it is? Okay. Okay, July 1756. And the name of this little story is called "Camp Followers Displease the Militia Chaplain." It says, hostile Indians controlled the forests and mountains along the Susquehanna River during the summer of 1756. The French and Indian War was underway. When Colonel William Clapham of the Pennsylvania militia marched his regiment upriver from John Harris's trading post at the present Harrisburg to build Fort Augusta at the confluence of the north and west branches, he kept his troops ready for encounters with hostile forces. Accompanying the expedition was a flotilla of 2 canoes and 20 flat-bottomed boats, manned by regimental boatmen and laden with provisions, supplies, cannons, and other big guns. Clapman's column had stopped along the Susquehanna's east shore a short distance north of the present-day Halifax and built a log fort to serve as a supply post for the much larger Fort Augusta. The soldiers spent several weeks at the new fort, which Clapham, boy I have trouble with that, which Clapham named Fort Halifax. But on July 1, Clapham ordered them to head for the confluence of the Susquehanna River. Many of Clapham's soldiers had brought women on the expedition. These camp followers had many legitimate responsibilities such as cooking, washing, mending, clothing, and nursing the ill or wounded troops. Even so, their presence hardly pleased the regimental chaplain, Reverend Charles Beatty. As the regiment prepared to depart, the chaplain urged the colonel to leave the women behind, especially those of bad character. Although Fort Halifax occupied a lonely spot in the woods about 20 miles north of Harris's trading post, the clergyman was so persuasive that Clapham arranged for the women, there must have been at least a dozen, to be paraded for review and judgment, Beatty wrote in his journal. As Clapham deliberated on the merits of the women, one of the officers pleaded for one and another for another, saying they could wash, they could do sewing and cooking, and the chaplain noted this. In the end, few women were prohibited from tagging along to Fort Augusta, and to Beatty's displeasure, even these would not stay but followed us that night and kept up with us. Okay, the rest is more on Fort Augusta up there. But if anybody's interested in these books, I'm going to leave these papers here. That tells you about John Moore and how to get the books in Northumberland, but it's really terrific reading. Now, does anybody have any questions?
What's that? There's stones there.
Oh, there's a lot of stuff I had here yet I didn't get to. I can go through that very quickly if you want to sit. This is the Indian medicine wheel, or sacred hoop. You'll very often find these laid out, not very often, but you'll sometimes find them laid out on the ground. If you look at National Geographic, you'll see these pictures of circular stones with spokes on them. You'll find this in many Indian designs. If you've ever been to a powwow, the dance circle is laid out as a sacred hoop. This is the east. You always enter the dance circle from the east. You always enter the sacred circle from the east. It's the place of the rising sun. Now each one of these four corners of the earth, or of the medicine wheel. And when they use the term medicine in this sense, it doesn't mean something you take for a cold. It means spiritual power. Now, the east is represented by the eagle. The eagle flies high and looks far into the future, and it's the place of the man, who also supposedly looks far into the future. The south is the place of the child, the place of humility, and the animal that represents it here in the east is the porcupine. The west is represented by the bear. It's the place of looking inside one's own self for answers, and it's the place of the woman. Because the women, because they lack the physical strength of the men, they more often use their inner intelligence to overcome problems, where the men will use his brawn. You go to the north is the place of the ancient ones, the older people. It's white like the color of the hair of an older person, and it's the place of wisdom. And when an Indian had a problem, he would very often go to the medicine wheel, and he would look at this problem in each aspect of the medicine wheel, looking far into the future, looking at his problem from the standpoint of a child as a point of humility, or looking into himself or herself for the answer, or trying to look at it through the wisdom of the ancient ones up here. This is the good red road of life, what they call the good red road of life. It goes from the child to the ancient ones, to the old people. And then they would pass away. When the older people died, they would come around to the entrance of the medicine wheel, which is always the east, and they would travel the blue road to the spirit world in the west, the place of the setting sun. Now there's a whole lot more to it, but that's basically what it is. And you'll find this in Indian design. And Indians say that unless you've lived your life in the four aspects of the medicine wheel, you really haven't lived a full life. Any more questions? Okay, thank you.